When I was a kid, my mom and my uncle used to buy me books on the presidents. My uncle in particular would buy me used books or encyclopedias that he found in garage sales and swap meets, and many of them dated back to the 1950s and 60s. So when I learned about the presidents, it was usually through the lens of the people living at the time. Now, presidential reputations can change over the years, so when I read more recent books, I noticed that there was a difference in how some presidents were perceived. For instance, Andrew Jackson was still considered a hero to many Americans in the 50s and 60s. Since then, he's become one of the most hated presidents in history. And some presidents have become more appreciated, like Dwight Eisenhower. With all that said, when I read these old books, one president really stood out, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And here's why. One of my encyclopedia sets from the 1960s was titled The Cultural Library. In the Famous People of All Time volume, FDR's entry begins with, quote, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the most controversial president of the United States. He was extravagantly admired and bitterly denounced. Almost no one was indifferent to him. When I read this now, it strikes me as a bit odd. FDR definitely had his share of critics, but he isn't the first president I think of when I think of the word controversial. I think more about people like Andrew Jackson because of the Indian Removal Act and the spoils system, or Richard Nixon because of Watergate, or pretty much any of our most recent presidents. Now, FDR was controversial, but I never really thought he was the most controversial president. Maybe the authors would revise that statement today, especially after the hyper-partisanship of the last few decades. Either way, it does give us a glimpse into how divisive FDR was at the time, how unprecedented he was, how for many people he was a huge departure from what came before him. So much so that 20 years after his presidency ended, some considered him the most controversial U.S. president of all time. I had another encyclopedia, this time on the presidents, titled The American Heritage Pictorial History. It also dates from the 1960s, and the intro to the FDR articles is one of the best in the whole set. I'll just read the whole thing. Quote, It seems to be a quality of the Roosevelt character, said Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, either to inspire a mad devotion that can see no flaw, or to kindle a hatred of an intensity that will admit of no virtue. And indeed, in the 12 years and 40 days of his presidency, Franklin Delano Roosevelt aroused a loyalty and an opposition unequaled in American history. To his enemies, Roosevelt was a dictator, a charlatan, a grinning poseur that read in the White House. Crowning his domestic treason, they cried later, Roosevelt personally plunged America into war with Germany and Japan, only to sell out to Stalin. To those who admired FDR, a decisive majority of Americans in 4 presidential elections, he was the friend of the poor, the champion of minorities, the defender of labor, the patrician savior of capitalism from menacing American communism in the nation's worst economic depression, the inspiring architect of the Allied victory over the Axis powers, and the prophet of a new world order under the United Nations. But no American, FDR friend or foe, could deny the vast drama and impact of Roosevelt's turbulent reign in the White House, the bloodless revolution he wrought in the economy and society of the nation through legal means, the sheer weight of his will on the form and scope of the presidential office, or the force of his personal diplomacy in shaping modern history. When he died, wrote William S. White, it seemed as if history itself had died, so central and vibrant a part of American life FDR had been. And to a generation who had known no other president, it seemed too as if the presidency had died, as if the United States could not go on. Notice the dramatic, grandiose terms the author uses to describe how people saw FDR. To those who loved him, he was an architect, a champion, and a prophet for a new age. Even the chapters on Washington and Lincoln don't resort to these extravagant terms. To his supporters, FDR was nothing short of the savior of the nation, if not the world. And notice how differently his critics saw him. To them, he was un-American, a communist, someone guilty of treason on the grandest scale. All this reflects the 2 main features of FDR's historical reputation. The first is just the sheer weight of his significance. The fact that he served for so long, 12 years, and during such a critical time ensures that FDR will remain one of the most significant presidents of all time. Anyone that would have served during the Great Depression and World War II was bound to be a big deal in the history books. The second is just how controversial he was. FDR at the time was the kind of guy that you either loved or hated. He changed a lot of things very dramatically, and that thrilled and angered a lot of people. And so he leaves behind a fascinating and very complicated legacy. I've always felt that FDR poses major dilemmas for both liberals and conservatives. I say this because if you're a liberal, you may celebrate FDR's accomplishments, but you also have to accept certain realities about him. You have to accept that he was responsible for the rounding up of hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans in one of the most egregious violations of civil liberties by a president in our country's history. That he was not an idealist like many liberals, but actually more of a shrewd politician. His coalition and even his closest advisors included segregationists. And more often, it was his wife Eleanor who seemed to genuinely care for the interests of the poor and minorities, and it was FDR who often had to be coaxed into action, and who could be stingy in using his political capital on their behalf. If you are a conservative, you have to concede the fact that Franklin Roosevelt was one of the most beloved and politically successful presidents in American history, that he ran a war effort resulting in the most celebrated military victory in American history, that at worst he avoided the mistakes micromanaging the war that Lyndon Johnson made in Vietnam, and at best was the architect of that victory, trusting and empowering great men like Marshall and Eisenhower, and that many conservative heroes like Ronald Reagan and Senator Bob Taft admired FDR, and finally, that he was a man who, despite the social stigma about disability, became a leader on the world stage. Many conservatives hate FDR, but I'm sure that more than a few can see something truly American about a man who refused to let that social stigma dictate his future. Now, if I were to do an episode on the entire life of FDR, it would have to be at least a 12-hour series, and we don't want to do that to you. Instead, we will focus on a period of his life that always fascinated me, the end of it. This isn't the FDR of the famous 100 Days, the one who captivated the nation by the sheer power of his strength and charisma. Instead, this is the FDR who, after years of leading the nation through depression and war, found himself physically exhausted, racing against his own mortality to build his vision for a new world. By then he believed he was working to save the world from future catastrophe. What we will find is a man who appeared to remain the master politician, mentally still at the top of his game, orchestrating events from behind the scenes. But those abilities were put to their greatest test when he faced an agonizing dilemma in the realm of world politics, whether to pursue that vision of a new world at the expense of our deepest values and in cooperation with one of the great mass murderers in all of history. And all the while he was physically at his weakest point and hiding a secret from the American people, a secret that exposed his country to great risk at a critical time. This is the FDR whose actions were both inspiring and unsettling, who we will explore in this episode of This American President, The Inscrutable Man, Part 1. Many of you are probably familiar with the general outline of FDR's story. He was the cousin of another famous Roosevelt, our 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt. FDR rose to the White House by defeating incumbent Herbert Hoover in the 1932 election. He took office in the midst of the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history. He dared to tell a broken nation, quote, that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Through a combination of personal charm, maybe even foolish optimism, and words of inspiration delivered through radio and newsreels, FDR rallied the nation desperate for leadership, and they rewarded him with the White House for an unprecedented 4 terms. His New Deal transformed the relationship between the government and the economy in the United States. And when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he transformed America again, this time into the arsenal of democracy. In FDR's words,
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Through his gallant leadership, the United States, along with the British and the Soviet Union, defeated Nazi Germany and Fascist Japan, and the United States emerged as the most powerful nation in the world. Like any leader, there is some truth to this popular narrative. But if you look closer, you see a far more complicated and fascinating picture. FDR has sometimes been described as brilliant, but those who met or knew him knew that his brilliance, unlike his cousin Theodore, was not of an intellectual sort. FDR was not a deep thinker or philosopher. There's a famous quote where Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously described FDR as having, quote, a second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament. Historian Richard Hofstadter wrote, quote, he lacked depth, but he also added that, quote, he had great breadth. So he wasn't in the class of fiercely intellectual thinker presidents like Thomas Jefferson or his cousin Teddy. There are two stories about FDR that illustrate his intellectual abilities. The first happened in the 1932 election, when his advisor, Raymond Moley, showed him two speeches with opposite viewpoints on tariff issues, one pro-protectionist and one in favor of tariff reduction. In response, FDR told Moley to, quote, weave them together. Moley was shocked that his boss seemed to not understand that the two viewpoints were irreconcilable. In another story, during his presidency, FDR's advisors arranged to have him meet the famous economist John Maynard Keynes with the hope that he could lend his expertise to the New Deal. From what I've read, Keynes began his presentation, and it didn't take him a very long time to completely lose the president. When Keynes left, a totally confused FDR told an aide, quote, I saw your friend Keynes. He left a whole rigmarole of figures. He must be a mathematician rather than a political economist. But what FDR didn't have in book smarts, he had in personality. Winston Churchill, in typical Churchillian style, described meeting FDR as the same feeling you get from opening your first bottle of champagne. FDR was someone who, through his smile and disposition, would light up a room just by entering it, and who was always the center of attention. These commentators paint a picture of a man who had sufficient IQ, but along with his keen temperament, had a towering EQ, or emotional intelligence. He understood people, how to reach them, how to connect with them, and how to inspire them. In other words, he had the perfect personality for politics. But he was not a wonk. He was bored by the nuances of policy. He cared less about issues and more about forging connections with people. I've always found it ironic that the man the country entrusted to deal with the worst economic crisis in its history was someone who, from these anecdotes, knew very little about the economy. And I've also found it ironic that the man Americans entrusted the White House more than anyone else was, in the eyes of many of his advisors, a pretty frustrating person to work for, even after several years of being president. His Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, who served as cabinet member for two previous administrations, described FDR as, quote, the poorest administrator I have ever worked under. FDR liked to create chaos among his staff, including his top advisors. When I say top advisors, I mean his cabinet members, the highest level officials in the government. He would give out contradictory information or leave them with the impression that he gave them his support, only to find out later that he didn't quite mean what he said. He may have charmed the public and the leaders of the world, but he exasperated those who worked for him. Some historians say that this was a sign of FDR's genius. They argue that he felt organized chaos was the best way for him to maintain leverage over his subordinates, or give him flexibility in making decisions. Others add that all this was necessary because it was FDR's nature to improvise decisions and change course as time went along. As I read about FDR, I came to realize that he had one of the best poker faces of any president in American history. He almost never showed his hand until he had to. In the words of Frank Walker, who served as the head of the Democratic Party, quote, Roosevelt would seldom express an opinion on anything. Historian John Keegan has described FDR as, quote, by far the most enigmatic leading figure of World War II. And as we'll see, it makes it near impossible to figure out his motives. It's part of what makes this time of FDR's life so intriguing, because we are left with far more questions about FDR's intentions than answers. So now that we've looked a little at FDR the man, let's look at the immediate context. In 1940, FDR was nearing the end of his second term. Most presidents would have been planning for their retirement. But in that year, he did something no other president had done: run for a third term in the White House. It was a controversial choice. George Washington set the precedent of stepping down after 2 terms, and no president had the audacity to run for the office 3 consecutive times. But as historian Doris Kearns Goodwin likes to say, this was no ordinary time. The world was in extreme turmoil. The fascist governments of Hitler's Germany, of Mussolini's Italy, and of Japan were on the march. Nation after nation fell to the Axis powers, who committed grievous atrocities on the civilian populations they conquered. Although many Americans were reluctant to break Washington's precedent, by 1940, far more feared having an untested leader at the helm during uncertain times. That year, FDR stood for an unprecedented third term, and despite the controversy of such an act, won that fall in a landslide, 449 electoral votes to 82. FDR's third term began on January 20th, 1941. World War II was already raging in Europe and Asia, but America was leery about jumping in. At the time, you have to remember that the nation was intensely isolationist, or, to use a more precise term, non-interventionist. Ever since the founding of the country, a strong current of non-interventionism ran through American foreign policy. This isn't to say that we never used force abroad before 1940, but it did mean that we remained wary of compromising our independence and of expending national resources in perpetual conflicts. And many Americans looked at our involvement in World War I as a mistake, as a sacrifice that wasn't worth the cost. So when FDR ran for his third term, he promised to the American people that he would not get involved if we could help it.
I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
The idea of non-interventionism might seem strange to us today, since we live in a time when thousands of soldiers are permanently deployed abroad in bases all around the world. But you have to remember, by 1940 we worked very hard to avoid foreign entanglements for a century and a half, and many Americans felt that this allowed us the space we needed to grow into a great power. FDR was a Wilsonian internationalist in prior years, but he knew that the American people were wary of global entanglements. So instead of sending soldiers, Roosevelt convinced Congress to supply France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China with warships, planes, and weapons under a program called Lend-Lease. December 7, 1941 changed all of that and removed non-interventionism as a viable political option. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and Hitler declared war on the United States, America entered World War II. This forever changed the geopolitical calculus. The Nazi and Japanese threats now convinced the United States that its own security was inextricably linked with the security of the rest of the world. As we saw earlier, FDR campaigned in 1940 saying that he wouldn't send American men into any foreign wars. But Pearl Harbor meant the war was no longer foreign. Japan had brought the war home to America. And in FDR, the country had a president who was all too happy to see non-interventionism replaced with what was called internationalism. The idea that the United States' security could be best served by engaging the world diplomatically and militarily. Now, the Allies, led by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, were taking on the Axis powers. As is often noted, World War II was the bloodiest conflict in world history, leading to an estimated 60 million deaths, featuring some of the worst atrocities ever recorded. But with the battles of Midway, Stalingrad, and El Alamein, the Allies began turning the tide. At the end of 1943, the leaders of the 3 major Allied nations, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Franklin Roosevelt, met in Tehran, Iran. It was the first time all three had met, and they discussed one of the biggest decisions of the war, when the United States and Great Britain would conduct an invasion across the English Channel into France to liberate Europe from the Nazis. At the time, the Soviet Union was bearing the vast majority of Hitler's wrath, and the numbers of that burden are just shocking. Estimates of Soviet deaths during World War II reached 25 to 30 million. 25 to 30 million out of a population of less than 200 million. The numbers are absolutely staggering. We're talking about 1 out of every 8 Soviet citizens dead. To give you a comparison, the United States had a population of about 130 million and lost about 400,000. That's about 1 out of every 300 or so people. Now, I'm not trying to minimize American sacrifice in World War II. 400,000 casualties are a lot of people, and they all certainly deserve our eternal gratitude. But if 400,000 deaths is a lot, 25 to 30 million is just insane. It's the most any country has ever lost in a war. So with Hitler pounding on the Soviet Union, you can imagine that its leader, Joseph Stalin, was a little anxious to get the United States and Great Britain in on the action. So at Tehran at the end of 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to invade France the following spring in May 1944. In return, Stalin agreed to launch a simultaneous offensive on the Eastern Front to prevent the Nazis from transferring forces to fight the Americans and the British. By the end of 1943, there remained a long, hard road before the Allies, but with the tide turning, the end was in sight. All three men now faced a critical question of what kind of world would they create in the aftermath of the war. Now let's look at where these three men, the Big Three as they were called, were coming from. FDR, Churchill, and Stalin were of the generation that came of age during World War I, which itself had been the worst war in history up to the time. They cut their teeth in that war as junior statesmen, and after that war, they saw statesmen try to put something in place that would ensure that another world war would never happen. And they saw that system fail. The world did go to war again less than 20 years later, and it was even more terrible than the first one, unspeakably terrible, beyond what they could have imagined. And if you've seen these two cataclysms occur within just a couple of decades, the possibility of a third world war, perhaps even more horrific, seemed very real. I mean, if the civilized world didn't get it right after the First World War, what guarantee did they have that it would get it right after the second one? Remember, the people alive at the time didn't have the hindsight we have today. They don't know that the 1950s are going to be a great era of peace and prosperity. They don't know that the Cold War would never erupt into a global hot war. What they do know is that two of the worst wars in human history occurred within 2 decades of each other, and that they decimated much of the civilized world. And with technology getting better and better, with killing whole populations getting easier and easier, who's to say that the next war wouldn't be the worst of all wars, maybe even the end of the world itself? So all three of them, in their own way, with a sense of urgency, found themselves working to build a world where a world war would never happen again. Only this time, it really had to work. Humanity, they believed, was at stake. But obviously, the security of their own country came first, meaning that post-war world looked different for each man. For Joseph Stalin, who lived through 2 catastrophic German invasions, that meant dismembering Germany and creating a buffer zone with Soviet-friendly governments in Eastern Europe. For Winston Churchill, it meant maintaining the strength of the British Empire. Now, FDR had his own vision. Earlier in Roosevelt's career, he had served under President Woodrow Wilson as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he witnessed firsthand Wilson's attempt to create the League of Nations. It was one of the most ambitious endeavors ever undertaken by a U.S. president. Wilson envisioned it as an international organization that would prevent future wars from breaking out through a combination of disarmament, arbitration, and collective security. Collective security is a concept in international relations where the security of each state within a system is invested in the security of the system as a whole. Therefore, when a threat to peace arises, the states in the system are committed to responding together as a collective. Wilson aimed nothing less for revolutionizing the way nations work together, maybe even rendering war obsolete. But Wilson failed to work with Republicans in the Congress to win support for the League. And although he tried to make the 1920 election a referendum on his vision, the nation overwhelmingly rejected the Democratic ticket that year, and elected Republican Warren Harding as president. Even worse for Wilson, while he was campaigning for the League across the nation, he suffered a severe stroke, rendering his whole left side paralyzed. The U.S. never joined the League of Nations, and as the Nazi, Italian, and Japanese governments began expanding at the expense of their neighbors, the League did virtually nothing to stop it. During the pivotal 1920 election year, FDR was the Democratic nominee for vice president on the ticket that went down in defeat. 24 years later, Roosevelt was the commander-in-chief of the United States, and he found himself in almost a similar dilemma as his former boss Woodrow Wilson was in, deciding what kind of world system would best prevent another global war. While FDR was more of a realist than his predecessor Woodrow Wilson, he knew that nations were reluctant to act on behalf of other nations. After all, his own nation had a long tradition of avoiding European conflicts. As FDR said,
"We are not fighting for, and we shall not obtain, a utopia."
But FDR still believed that collective action could work, and fearing a third world war, he believed that it had to work.
The very fact that we are now to work on the organization of peace proves that the great nations are committed to trust each other. Put this proposition any way you want. It's bound to come out the same way. We either work with the other great nations, or we might someday have to fight them.
And that's when he came up with the idea of the Four Policemen. I always thought that was a pretty cool name, like the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, except these four would work together to prevent apocalypse. So the idea is that they would semi-revive the League of Nations, only this time the four great powers of the world would play the biggest role in keeping the peace. Essentially, they would act as, well, global policemen. If any country would become a threat to its neighbors, say the way Germany did during the World Wars, these four would band together under the principle of collective security and use force to eliminate that threat. Now, as you can imagine, many people saw this kind of commitment as a violation of their country's sovereignty. They feared being obligated to send troops in endless wars. So FDR tweaked the idea, saying that only air power rather than troops on the ground would be necessary. If the world's four greatest powers could join forces, they could unleash a reign of terror from the air that could deter or eliminate any threat. So the countries that FDR had in mind for this were pretty obvious, maybe with one exception. The United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union would be part of the Big Four. The fourth one was an interesting choice, China. Well, I say interesting because China wasn't the powerhouse in 1944 that it is today. It was carved up regionally by warlords, ideologically between communists and nationalists, and had been ruined by civil war and the Japanese invasion. But FDR believed that China, with its long history and enormous population, was destined to play a critical role within a generation, and he touted them as a member of the quartet. So FDR dreamed of remaking the world over with his Four Policemen. And while FDR was a bit more of a realist, it was quite ambitious in and of itself. It's kind of ironic. I remember when I was in college, the Bush administration invaded Iraq. And I remember a lot of my Democratic friends were against the war, and one of the arguments they used was that the United States couldn't be the world's policeman. And of course some Republicans said the same thing. But there was a time when a Democrat president, maybe the most significant Democrat president of all time, actually wanted to institutionalize our country as one of the world's policemen, far beyond anything George W. Bush wanted. Now, there was one fact that most observers knew by 1944. The United States and the Soviet Union would emerge as the most powerful geopolitical powers in the world. So with FDR committed to reviving Wilson's League, he believed that the only way it would work would be to have buy-in from Stalin and the Soviet Union. He felt that cooperation with Stalin was critical to winning the war and securing the peace. Right before they met in Tehran, FDR said, quote, "The whole question of whether we can win or lose the war depends on the Russians. If the Russians can hold out this summer and keep 3.5 million Germans engaged in war, we can definitely win." Referring to his post-war plans, FDR said, quote, "We won't get any strong international organization unless the Soviet Union and the U.S. work together to build it up as the years go by. So for the next year and a half, you have one of the most controversial aspects of FDR's presidency. You see FDR cultivating a friendship with one of the most brutal dictators in history. Now, FDR relied a great deal on his personal charm, and who could blame him? By then, it allowed him to become one of the most popular presidents ever. Well, as the war was winding down, FDR believed that that same charm could work on Joseph Stalin. Now, I haven't studied Stalin in depth, but I know enough about him to know that he was a pretty brutal human being. This is a man who made himself the totalitarian leader of the biggest country in the world. This is a man who, by then, had unleashed a purge during the 1930s that led to the deaths of about 1 million people. Some estimates said that about 1,000 people a day were killed in the Soviet Union every day for at least a couple of years. 1,000 people a day dead. Think of the sheer terror that imposed on the Russian people. Oh, by the way, he also engineered a famine in Ukraine that was said to have killed anywhere from 5 to 12 million people. And he also approved the mass execution of about 20,000 Polish citizens in 1940 in what became known as the Katyn Massacre. And these millions of deaths don't even count those he would kill until his death in 1953. Now, these events had been suppressed in the Soviet Union, but enough information was out there, and Roosevelt was in a position to know about them. We know that he was aware of the Katyn Massacre. At any rate, this same man, Joseph Stalin, a man responsible for the deaths of millions, was seen by FDR as indispensable to keeping the peace and saving the world. Now, I'm not trying to be a Monday morning quarterback here. The fact of the matter is that the United States allied with Joseph Stalin during World War II, something that the vast majority of Americans then and now believed was necessary to defeat the Nazi war machine. And why not? In a fallen world, it's possible that one must sometimes work shrewdly and cooperate with a lesser evil to defeat a greater evil. But this becomes a tougher issue when that greater evil is being eliminated. As the Nazis faded, many observers knew that the United States and the Soviet Union were destined to be the two superpowers of the world. And some began to ask, how would the United States deal with Stalin then? How much should it trust the Soviet Union? It is in this context that we find some of the most controversial comments FDR ever made. FDR reportedly told one of his aides, quote, "I think if I give him being Stalin, everything I possibly can and ask for nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, he will not try to annex anything and will work with me for a world of democracy and peace." FDR really believed in the power of his own charm to work on Stalin. To Churchill, he wrote in 1942, quote, "I think I can personally handle Stalin better than either of your Foreign Office or my State Department. Stalin hates the guts of all your top people. He thinks he likes me better, and I hope he will continue to do so." Now, I don't say these things to critique FDR, but to simply point out a fact. By 1944, FDR believed the world was such that Joseph Stalin was a critical part to winning the war and preventing a third world war, and would do anything in his power to win him over. Now, before we go any further with all of that, there is one factor that must be mentioned because it's critical to this entire story, and it's a factor that very few Americans knew much about. By 1944, FDR was beginning his 12th year as president, and as most people know, that's the most of anyone in history. Well, those years had been tumultuous years, and they were taking their toll. Have you ever seen those images comparing what presidents looked like at the beginning of their terms with what they looked like at the end of their terms? They'll usually show Lincoln in 1861 where he looks pretty young and compare it to 1865 where he looks dramatically older. Or maybe they'll show a recent president and how much he's grayed after 8 years. Well, if you have some time, you should look up what Franklin Roosevelt looked like in 1933 and what he looked like in 1945. At the start of his presidency, he was a pretty youthful 51. He had a robust upper body, which probably came from all the exercise he got after contracting polio. By 1944, he was 62. Now, 62 is definitely middle-aged, but it's not extremely old. But by then, FDR had changed dramatically. He had lost a significant amount of weight. He stopped fitting in his suits. His face and neck got thinner, and the lines were more pronounced. The bags and rings under his eyes grew larger and darker. Sometimes his jaw hung down, mouth open. Those who saw him said that his complexion went from being tan to gray. So in 1944 to 1945, you start seeing his friends and advisors describing him, to use an uncomfortable term, as death warmed over. In 1944, Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau wrote, quote, "I was really shocked for the first time because he is a very sick man and seems to have wasted away." And the president also had a pretty bad tremor. FDR's vice president at the time, Henry Wallace, wrote that during a speech, quote, "his whole body shook, and especially his right arm, which grasped the rail of the reading stand." One official from the New York Times wrote the following after meeting with FDR, quote, "When I entered the president's office and had my first glimpse of him in several months, I was shocked and horrified, so much so that my impulse was to turn around and leave. I felt that I was seeing something I shouldn't see. He had lost a great deal of weight. His shirt collar hung so loose on his neck that you could have put your hand inside it. He was sitting there with a vague glassy-eyed expression on his face, and his mouth was hanging open. Repeatedly, he would lose his train of thought, stop, and stare blankly at me. It was an agonizing experience for me." FDR himself would complain constantly about feeling terrible, saying that he often felt, quote, "like hell." Some found FDR tired and disengaged. One advisor said that he had a, quote, "lack of interest in the problems facing him," and lacked, quote, "the power to make decisions." Now, ever since 1932, FDR's personal physician was a man named Ross Mcintyre. Mcintyre had risen in the Navy, eventually to the position of Vice Admiral and Surgeon General. At the start of 1944, FDR had already suffered from the flu, a case of bronchitis, stomach cramps, and headaches. While FDR had gotten over most of those ailments, he now had the appearance of a very sick man, so much so that his daughter, Anna Roosevelt Looked, met with Mcintyre around mid-March 1944 to figure out what was wrong. Within a couple of weeks, Mcintyre arranged for a cardiologist, Dr. Howard Bruin, to examine the president. After the exam, Dr. Bruin later described it as, quote, "shocking," and the president's condition as, quote, "god-awful." Now, I'm a complete layman when it comes to medical issues, so I'll just read off what his diagnosis was. FDR apparently had acute congestive heart failure, specifically in the left ventricle. As a result, his heart had become enlarged. His blood pressure was very high, and he had an oxygen deficiency, the source of his skin graying. His condition was so bad that Dr. Bruin recommended a significant reduction in the president's work and physical activity and a major change to his diet. This meant FDR could only work a couple of hours in the morning and in the afternoon, that he needed rest or naps in the midday and before dinner, and that he needed 10 hours of sleep every night. In addition, he prescribed a sedative and digitalis to reduce his swollen heart and recommended that he cut down his smoking and swimming and only eat bland foods. In essence, Bruin was saying that FDR could only work 10 to 15 hours a week at most, which means that the President of the United States during the world's greatest conflict had, as author Joseph Lelyveld described, the workload of a bank teller. Admiral Mcintyre was shocked by the diagnosis and didn't think FDR could afford to cut down his workload. But the president took up most of the prescribed regimen. For the next 3 weeks, FDR slept in and took dinner in bed. Now, as I said earlier, FDR had one of the best poker faces of all time, and when it came to hiding the extent of his health issues, he was a well-practiced master. Remember, this is a man who, for about 16 years, had given the American people the illusion that he had largely overcome polio, even though he couldn't walk. Well, to this day, the nature and extent of FDR's health problems at the end of his life are still the subject of debate and speculation. Doctors and historians have pored through medical records, photos, and eyewitness accounts to discern exactly what accounted for FDR's rapid decline. Some doctors who have studied the issue believe that FDR had some form of cancer, perhaps melanoma or stomach cancer, which he and his doctors hid from the public. Again, not knowing much about the subject, I won't venture any guess. But the fact of the matter is, at the tail end of World War II, the President of the United States was a very sick man, far sicker than the vast majority of Americans realized. I say all that to say that this has implications not only for what happened at the time, but for how we view the events that happened. And one of those events was the 1944 election. FDR was already serving an unprecedented third term. If he stood for re-election in 1944, he would potentially be serving a fourth term, one that would last until January 20th, 1949, which must have felt like an eternity away. By then he would have served 16 years as president, assuming he served or lived all the way through. And in the run-up to the election, while FDR was declining into a shell of the man he once was, his doctor, specifically Admiral Mcintyre, was telling the country that their president was doing just fine. He would say things like, quote, "The president's health is excellent. I can say that unqualifiedly." And as far as we can tell, most people believed it, perhaps because they wanted to believe it. As I read about what people said, I was so struck by the sense of resignation or denial that people had about the whole situation. Here they were during World War II, during the critical time when the Allies had to seal the deal, vanquish the enemy, and plan the post-war world. So much was at stake. And the man who perhaps had most to do with those outcomes, especially if he ran for a fourth term, was barely functional. You would think that more people would try to say something or do something about it, to get FDR to prepare for the possibility of his own mortality, maybe make plans for retirement, or worse, and ensure that his vice president was ready to take office. But there seemed to be this strange sense of complacency about the whole issue. One Democratic Party official, Ed Flynn, asked Eleanor Roosevelt to intervene, but apparently she never did. She later wrote, quote, "All of us knew that Franklin was far from well, but none of us ever said anything about it. I suppose it was because we felt that if he believed it was his duty to continue in office, there was nothing for us to do but make it as easy as possible for him." Now, the Democratic Convention was scheduled to take place from July 19th to the 21st, 1944, in Chicago, and FDR waited until just before the convention to make his decision known. To some of his aides, FDR indicated that he was weary of the job and was not looking forward to running for a fourth term, which was understandable considering his health. In May 1944, he said to his top aide, Admiral William Leahy, quote, "Bill, I just hate to run for election. Perhaps the war by that time will have progressed to a point where it will not be necessary for me to be a candidate." Some historians believe that FDR was hoping that the upcoming invasion of Normandy would be so successful that ultimate victory in Europe would be so guaranteed that he could retire. To his close confidant, Daisy Suckley, he said, quote, "It wouldn't be fair to the American people to run for another term." Why wouldn't it be fair to run for another term? Well, as I said before, it's hard to know what FDR was thinking. But on July 10th, 1944, a physician named Frank Leahy, who had recently examined FDR at the request of Admiral Mcintyre, penned a memo that, if it was released, would have had major implications for the American political landscape. In the memo, Dr. Leahy stated he was documenting his thoughts, quote, "in the event there comes any criticism of me at a later date." Leahy wrote that he, quote, "did not believe if Mr. Roosevelt were elected president again, he had the physical capacity to complete a term," and that, quote, "it was my opinion that over the 4 years of another term with its burdens, he would again have heart failure and would be unable to complete it." Leahy states that he informed Admiral Mcintyre of this opinion 2 days earlier, July 8, 1944, and that, quote, "Admiral Mcintyre was in agreement with this." He impressed upon Mcintyre that it was his duty to inform President Roosevelt of his condition. He also stated that he informed Admiral Mcintyre he felt, quote, "strongly that if he," meaning FDR, "does not accept another term, he had a very serious responsibility concerning who is vice president." Leahy finished that, quote, "Admiral Mcintyre agrees with this and has, he states, so informed Mr. Roosevelt." Now, the intriguing thing about this memo is that it was actually kept from the public for over 60 years and released only in the past decade. And it provides evidence that FDR's primary doctor, and likely FDR himself, was aware that at least one medical professional was of the opinion that he would not survive a fourth term. But one day after the memo was written, FDR announced that he would accept the nomination for a fourth term from the Democratic Party. Why would FDR run for a fourth term, knowing that he might not survive that term? Well, there's no definitive answer, especially when it comes to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But we can speculate. It's safe to say that FDR was invested in implementing his vision for the four policemen and was willing to bet his shaky health on the chance to see that vision realized. He may have been in denial, and there may have been political reasons. Although the Republicans had lost 3 straight presidential elections in landslides, they made big gains in the 1942 elections. Some polls actually showed that if the war ended before the election, a Republican candidate had a chance to win the presidency if domestic issues were in the spotlight. Since FDR had dominated the Democratic Party, it seemed to many that there was no one else in the party with the stature to win the presidency. Perhaps FDR ran because he believed no one else could keep the Democrats in the White House. Whatever the reasons were, the Democratic Party wasn't planning to turn its back on its greatest electoral winner in history, regardless of his failing health. FDR would stand for a fourth term. So for the rest of this episode, I'll focus on one of the more intriguing and debated moments of FDR's life. I've brought up the broader geopolitical context. I've brought up Stalin, Churchill, and the UN. These issues will come up again in part 2 of this series. But for now, I'll focus on a subject closer to home, but one that would come to affect those broader issues. And that subject is the Democratic vice presidential nomination of 1944. Now, with FDR poised to run for a fourth term, Dr. Leahy struck upon an insight obvious to any observer. If FDR was likely to die in the next 4 years, the selection of a vice president could very well be the selection of a president, and one who would likely serve during a very critical time, a time that would include closing out the war and molding a new world. Dr. Leahy knew this, as did many officials in the Democratic Party, and more than a few Americans probably thought about it. But there is one person whose opinion on the issue we know very little about, the one person who had the most influence over the decision, and that is Franklin Roosevelt himself. In no account or recollection from those that knew him do we see FDR pondering the weighty consequences that would result from selecting the 1944 Democratic vice presidential nominee. What we do see are instances of random musings and contradictory statements by the master politician himself. Prior to announcing a run for a fourth term, FDR bandied about the names of random political and public figures as possible successors. Some were from left field, like Henry Kaiser, the shipbuilding magnate. When Roosevelt announced his candidacy, several names were tossed around for the vice presidency, and one of them included one of his closest advisors, a man named Jimmy Burns. By then, Burns had a stellar resume, having served in Congress, as a justice on the Supreme Court, the head of the Office of War Mobilization, and as an advisor to FDR, so close to the president that he was nicknamed the Assistant President. With all that said, Roosevelt could have stuck with the man who was already the Vice President of the United States at that moment, the man he had handpicked as his running mate 4 years earlier, a man named Henry Wallace. Now, in addition to my fascination with presidents, I've always had a fascination with vice presidents. And Wallace has to be about the most interesting vice president in American history. Henry Wallace grew up in Iowa in a Presbyterian family. His family were pioneers in the field of scientific farming, and during Wallace's childhood, they even took in famed botanist George Washington Carver. Wallace's father had been Secretary of Agriculture under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, and Wallace had established himself as an authority on agriculture, statistics, and econometrics. In 1944, FDR appointed him as Secretary of Agriculture, the same post his father had had less than 10 years earlier, and Wallace had earned Roosevelt's favor by becoming one of the most steadfast supporters of the New Deal. As a reward for his strong liberalism and loyalty, FDR selected him as his running mate in the 1940 election as he ran for his third term. Many in the Democratic Party, especially from the conservative wing, were not happy with FDR's unconventional choice. But this went beyond politics. Henry Wallace wasn't just a liberal, he struck many as a bit weird. Wallace was known to have unconventional religious beliefs. He was often described as a mystic, or someone whose beliefs are akin to New Age spiritualism. Much later in life, Wallace said, quote, "I know that I'm often called a mystic, and in the years following my leaving the United Presbyterian Church, I would say I probably was a practical mystic." Some historians consider the accusations of mysticism overplayed, but Wallace's biographers John Culver and John Hyde agree that his beliefs were very much outside the American religious mainstream. There was something else that concerned people about Wallace, and that was his association with a Russian painter turned spiritual philosopher named Nicholas Rorick. Now, Rorick was definitely one of those out there kind of guys. He said and wrote things like, quote, "When the supremacy of the densified astral body is realized, then the locks of the fourth gate will unbolt." And apparently Wallace took an interest in him, becoming a friend and admirer of his work. Wallace wrote to Rorick, quote, "Long have I been aware of the occasional fragrance from that other world, which is the real world. But now I must live in the outer world, and at the same time make over my mind and body to serve as fit instruments for the Lord of Justice. Yes, the chalice is filling." Now, Rorick ran into some controversy, eventually getting audited by the U.S. government, and Wallace distanced himself from him. But the Republican Party got a hold of letters between Wallace and Rorick, including one in which he addressed Rorick as, quote, "Dear Guru." The GOP threatened to expose what became known as the Dear Guru letters in the 1940 election. And they may have done so had the Democrats not threatened to release information about the Republican nominee's extramarital affairs. So Wallace stayed on the ticket and ended up getting elected vice president under Roosevelt, and served pretty much during the bulk of U.S. involvement in World War II. But his vice presidential term didn't go so well. FDR gave him a decent amount of responsibility, like naming him head of the Board of Economic Warfare, but Wallace feuded with conservative Democrats in the administration, and, with his outspoken liberalism, ended up alienating America's ally Winston Churchill himself. What angered Churchill the most was Wallace's attack on European colonialism. As Wallace himself said,
"The world community all that they have received. No nation will have the God-given right to exploit other nations. Older nations will have the privilege to help younger nations get started on the path to industrialization. But there must be neither military nor economic imperialism. The methods of the 19th century will not work in the people's century, which is now about to begin."
By this time, FDR stopped keeping Wallace involved in war planning. Now, I've been talking about Wallace for the past few minutes because I want to re-emphasize that this is the man FDR elevated to the second highest ranking office in the land, a man who at best was politically naive and had questionable associations, and who at worst, some say, was sympathetic to communism. At any rate, with FDR's health waning and the nation and the world at a critical point in history, the Democratic Party bosses knew that renominating Wallace for VP could mean one thing: a future President Henry Wallace. And not only that, but a President Wallace who was in the position to build and shape the post-war world. The prospect of such a scenario terrified many conservative bosses. So as the Democrats convened for their convention, the bosses determined to stop a Wallace presidency from happening. But they knew that one man had the biggest say in the matter, the man who put Wallace there in the first place, President Roosevelt. And it's here where we get a real sense of FDR's poker face. Historians have picked apart the events of the 1944 Democratic Convention for over 70 years. But it's still unclear what FDR's role was in all of this, how much he was controlling things behind the scenes, or how much he was reacting to events. Now, I'm not going to figure all of that out, but we can get an idea of the haphazard nature in which all of it took place. In the run-up to the convention, FDR told party officials that unlike in 1940, he wasn't planning to dictate his choice for running mate, and one man wanted the VP nomination more than anyone else: FDR's assistant president, Jimmy Burns. But there were a few problems, political problems. The first was that Jimmy Burns was raised a Catholic, something that many Protestants didn't like, but had left the faith to become Episcopalian, something that Catholics didn't like. Second, Burns was pro-segregationist, something that liberal Democrats didn't like. This could cost FDR the votes of African Americans. Still, in June 1944, a month before the convention, Burns met with FDR and apparently came away thinking that he was the president's choice for vice president. Burns took this as a signal to start rallying support among convention delegates. During this time, you have accounts of FDR telling different people different things, some of which may have been random musings, or maybe attempts to spread misinformation. With FDR, you can never tell. At the same time, he quite shrewdly sent Vice President Wallace out on a trip to China and Russia in the weeks prior to the convention, critical days that Wallace could have used to rally support for his renomination. Wallace ended up being gone for 51 days, and while he was in Russia, the Soviets showed him a very rosy version of life out in Siberia, which heartened Wallace, who assumed it was reflective of how most Russians lived. At any rate, it's an indication that FDR was becoming wary of Vice President Wallace. The party bosses had convinced Roosevelt that his vice president could cost him millions of conservative votes. The president told an aide, quote, "I would like to have him as my running mate, but I simply cannot risk creating a permanent split in the party by making the same kind of fight for him that I did at the convention 4 years ago." By then, two more names were being discussed: Supreme Court Associate Justice William O. Douglas, a man who FDR enjoyed playing poker with, and Missouri Senator Harry S. Truman. Harry Truman, by then 60 years old, was in his 10th year as a U.S. Senator. He didn't have a college degree, and once held a series of clerical jobs, working in a mailroom, and famously ran a haberdasher business. But he demonstrated courage and leadership during World War II, and caught the eye of the most powerful political figure in Kansas City, Tom Pendergast. Truman was elected a local judge and eventually U.S. Senator. Although he was seen as a lackey for Pendergast, Truman carved out a reputation for independence and honesty as the chairman of the Committee on Military Affairs. It was through this assignment that Harry Truman became a national figure as he investigated waste and fraud in war contracts. The committee reportedly saved taxpayers $15 billion, chump change today, but big money in 1944. One of Roosevelt's closest aides, Harry Hopkins, reportedly said, talking of Truman, quote, "The president had his eye on him for a long time." If Hopkins is right, Jimmy Burns and Henry Wallace didn't know. When Wallace returned from his trip mid-July, he met with the president soon after. And just like Burns, Wallace felt after that meeting that he was the president's choice for vice president. And Wallace wanted something in writing. So on July 10th, less than 2 weeks before the convention, Wallace asked FDR to sign a letter of endorsement. It read, quote, "If I were a delegate to the convention, I would vote for Henry Wallace." It was perfect Roosevelt language, enough to satisfy his audience, namely Wallace and his supporters, but short of an outright commitment. It was as close to an endorsement that the guarded president would permit. The next day, on July 11th, FDR met with party leaders at the White House to figure out who would take the VP slot. One of the attendees was a man named Bob Hannigan, who was the chair of the Democratic National Committee, and who, like Truman, hailed from Missouri. During the meeting, they went over the list of potential vice presidential candidates, and apparently it was the classic Goldilocks dilemma. Burns was too conservative, and Wallace too liberal. Both represented major political liabilities. Both could cost the Democrats millions of votes from key constituencies. By then, it appeared, the choices had narrowed to Douglas and Truman. Of Douglas, FDR reportedly said, quote, "Bill Douglas has a nice crop of hair, plays an interesting game of poker." But one historian speculates Douglas was not under serious consideration since he had very little political experience, and like Wallace, was a strong liberal who would alienate conservatives. Now here's where things get a bit murky, due in no small part to FDR's own caginess. FDR worked very hard to look like he wasn't ruling anyone out, Wallace included. He didn't want to be the guy that dropped the axe. But he also acknowledged that Burns and Wallace could be liabilities. Later, most of the attendees, including Hannigan, claimed that they individually convinced FDR to drop Wallace. One of the attendees, Ed Flynn, later insisted that adding Truman to the ticket was FDR's original idea. Some said that FDR got Flynn to bring up Truman's name at the meeting, and, when he did, the president pretended that he had never even thought of it. At any rate, FDR reacted positively to the prospect of a Roosevelt-Truman ticket and praised the Missouri senator's work on the committee. Hannigan touted Truman as being politically astute and, since he was from a border state, acceptable to both Northerners and Southerners. At this point, we have conflicting testimony. One attendee said FDR closed the meeting with, quote, "Boys, it's Truman." Others say that he remained non-committal. But it was clear by the end of the meeting that Douglas and Truman had risen above Wallace and Burns. Still, FDR wasn't ready to say it publicly. Now, after the men had left the meeting, one of them turned to Hannigan and suggested getting something in writing from the president. Hannigan agreed, and immediately went back to Roosevelt. When he returned, he had a handwritten note in which FDR expressed that he would be happy to run with either Douglas or Truman. Hannigan later noticed that FDR had written Douglas's name ahead of Truman, which might be interpreted to mean that Douglas was his top choice. More on that later. Now, if you think that things were cleared up, think again. You would think that after the meeting, FDR would make it easy for the bosses to work to get Douglas or Truman the nomination. But the next day, FDR stirred up more uncertainty and confusion by assuring his assistant president, Jimmy Burns, quote, "You must not get out of the race. If you stay in, you're sure to win." And a few days later, FDR and Wallace met. Roosevelt assured his vice president by taking his hand, drawing him close, smiling, and saying, as Wallace recounted himself, quote, "Henry, I hope it will be the same old team."
Because I can remember him pulling me down so his mouth was next to my ear and saying, "Henry, I hope it will be the same old team."
Politically brilliant or just plain devious? With FDR, it was probably a little bit of both. So on July 13th, FDR left Washington for a trip to the West Coast with a stop in Chicago. The Democratic Convention would be held in Chicago less than a week later. Jimmy Burns at this point was convinced that he was FDR's choice. He told Hannigan what FDR told him. This left Hannigan quite confused as to who the president's real choice was, so he went to Chicago to meet with FDR to get the truth from the horse's mouth. Again, there is ambiguity in the historic record. But during this meeting, Hannigan supposedly pushed FDR to choose Truman. The president remained non-committal, but Hannigan was able to get something that might be of use in the future. He again got a handwritten letter from FDR saying that he could run with both Douglas and Truman, and he got the president's secretary to type it up on White House letterhead dated July 19th. But this time, it had Truman's name ahead of Douglas's. Now, Burns believed his vice presidential candidacy was still alive, and after his personal discussions and assurances with FDR, he was confident that he could win. But his support for segregation remained an albatross around his neck. Just before the convention, a few liberal groups began to voice their opposition to Burns, including the NAACP and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. They preferred Wallace, but would accept Truman, and that was the death knell for Burns' aspirations, convincing the president that he would lose those millions of liberal votes. At that point, FDR confided to Democratic Party leader Frank Walker to go all out for Truman. So everything was now set for Truman's nomination for the vice presidency. Everything, of course, except for Truman himself. In fact, Harry Truman, the man the president and the party bosses were arranging to nominate, had actually planned to give a speech nominating Burns for the vice presidency. He even had a copy of his speech in his pocket ready to deliver the delegates. So at the convention, when the party bosses sounded Truman on his potential nomination, he balked and said he wasn't interested. Historians speculate as to why he wasn't interested. Some say it was because he had his wife and sister on his Senate payroll, and while it wasn't unheard of for a politician to hire a family member, he feared how it would look. Others say that he knew that the next vice president would become president, and quite honestly, who wanted to follow in FDR's footsteps in the middle of a war and post-war Reconstruction? His wife Bess was also known to hate the public eye. Besides, Truman knew about FDR's legendary political skills and thought that he may have thrown out his name just as a stalking horse. There was no way Truman felt he was really FDR's choice. Now, the party bosses knew they had some work to do to get the skeptical Truman on board. What follows is one of the most memorable moments in American political history. One evening of the convention, July 19th or 20th, different accounts say different things, the bosses invited Truman over to their room in the Blackstone Hotel. There, Hannigan reiterated that Truman was the president's choice, but Truman still refused to believe it. President Roosevelt then called. When the president spoke, Hannigan held the phone out so Truman could hear. And this is how the conversation went, as Truman later remembered it. Roosevelt: "Bob, have you got that fellow lined up yet?" Hannigan: "No, he's the contrariest Missouri mule I've ever dealt with." Roosevelt: "Well, you tell him, if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war, that's his responsibility." With that, Roosevelt slammed the phone down. Harry Truman later said that he, quote, was completely stunned. One reporter who witnessed the exchange said Truman looked, quote, scared to death. According to one account, Truman paced around the room for a couple of seconds in complete silence. No one said a word. What was Truman thinking about? Was he thinking about how his life was about to change forever? Had he heard the rumors of FDR's health? Was he thinking about the prospect of being president, maybe even a wartime president? Truman then blurted out an expletive and said, quote, "Well, if that's the situation, I have to say yes. But why the hell didn't he tell me in the first place?" I've always found this scene fascinating. The president by then wanted Truman as vice president. The party bosses finally had their candidate, who wasn't named Henry Wallace. The biggest roadblock that was left was getting Truman on board. Clearly in this situation, they made it appear as if FDR didn't know that Truman could hear him. But it's likely that FDR did know. And when you think about it, it was classic Roosevelt. Through a mix of deception and showmanship, FDR got what he wanted. And it's also a moment where a single person's life can get swept up in events beyond their control. That was the situation Harry Truman found himself. Here was a man who didn't seek the vice presidency, and seemed to do as much as he could to avoid it. And yet, through a torturous series of events, many of them orchestrated by Roosevelt himself, he found himself where he never expected to be, the running mate to an aging, weary war president. And as we'll see, history made a slight shift that night that would have enormous consequences later on. Roosevelt was easily renominated at the convention, nominated for an unprecedented fourth term. And although he and the party bosses had Truman on board, they actually had to get the Missouri senator nominated. They still had to seal the deal. Now, Wallace still had the support of many liberals in the party and at the convention. When he appeared on the convention floor, delegates burst into applause, lasting about 15 minutes. It was a bad omen for the party leadership. While Wallace was hated by conservatives, he still had a strong base of support in the party. In fact, a recent Gallup poll showed that Wallace was the preferred choice for vice president for 65% of Democratic voters. Truman, barely known outside of Missouri and Washington, only got 2% of respondents. Now, Wallace, with his limited political skills, had decided not to take part in all of the closed-door machinations. This was a big disadvantage for Wallace. As one of his supporters wrote, he, quote, talking about Wallace, is wholly unprepared for the devious type of warfare which is being waged around him, and is almost unaware of it. Wallace had no floor managers or posters for the floor when the convention began, but he was scheduled to give a speech to the delegates on July 20th, which was an opportunity to boost his chances for the nomination. Although Wallace knew that the conservatives were a powerful force in the party, he doubled down, unabashedly embracing his liberalism before a packed house of over 30,000. He described FDR as, quote, the greatest liberal in the history of the United States, and said, quote, the strength of the Democratic Party has always been the people, plain people like so many of those here in this convention, ordinary folks, farmers, workers, and businessmen along Main Street. Jefferson, Jackson, and Woodrow Wilson knew the power of the plain people. All three laid down the thesis that the Democratic Party can win only if and when it is the liberal party. The future belongs to those who go down the line unswervingly for liberal principles of both political democracy and economic democracy. By nominating Franklin Roosevelt, the Democratic Party is again declaring its faith in liberalism. Wallace's speech brought the House down and got the loudest response of any speaker at the convention. Liberals attending and listening on the radio were thrilled. An elderly progressive senator later wrote Wallace saying, quote, "The effect on the country and all those who will read that speech is that it was one of the most courageous exhibitions ever seen at a political convention in this country." The reaction confirmed all the worst fears of the party bosses. Wallace was an unapologetic liberal, and he seemed to have captured the delegates' hearts, at least for the moment. They knew that, if they didn't do something then, the delegates, caught up in a pro-Wallace frenzy, might nominate him for VP in acclamation. Their plan to get rid of Wallace would be foiled, so the bosses went to work. Bob Hannigan circulated the letter from the president that mentioned Truman and Douglas that evening. Unfortunately, it didn't have the effect that he had hoped, since it was more of a weak endorsement and gave the delegates the impression that Truman and Wallace were the party machine's choices. The audience continued to chant, "We want Wallace! We want Wallace!" The bosses felt the convention was getting out of control. The Wallace forces sensed their opportunity. A Wallace ally, Florida Senator Claude Pepper, motioned to be recognized so he could nominate Wallace. The party bosses were desperate. If Pepper was recognized, Wallace's nomination might soon follow. They soon turned to one of their own, Chicago Mayor Ed Kelly, who tried to end the session by claiming the size of the crowd violated the building's codes. Although Senator Pepper continued to motion for recognition, the convention chair, a party boss named Sam D. Jackson, refused to give him the floor. Hannigan demanded the chair end the session, but Jackson feared a riot would break out. Pepper refused to give up and tried to step up to the podium to nominate Wallace. Just as he got there, Jackson called for a motion to adjourn. The crowd screamed, "No, no," but Jackson slammed the gavel, saying, "The ayes have it." The session ended. Mayor Kelly's police then entered the floor and began pushing the delegates out of the convention for the day. With that, the bosses successfully stopped the best chance Henry Wallace had to becoming the nominee. But the bosses weren't finished. They then worked through the night to ensure Wallace's demise and Truman's nomination. They reached every state chairman, telling them that Truman was FDR's choice. Biographers John Culver and John Hyde wrote, quote, "Ambassadorships were offered, postmaster positions were handing out, cold cash changed hands." It's hard to know everything that was promised, but the bosses were at work. When the convention gathered the next day, Friday, July 21st, observers noted that the atmosphere of the convention had changed. Wallace's momentum was gone. His name was placed for the nomination along with 16 other people. On the first ballot, Wallace showed strength, leading all candidates with 429 votes, but Truman wasn't far behind with 319 votes. But after that, the delegates began flipping for the real choice, the choice that the bosses worked hard for them to make. On the second ballot, Harry Truman ran away with the nomination, winning 1,031 votes to 105 for Wallace. Harry Truman himself was caught by surprise at how quickly the delegates selected him. He had been eating a sandwich when he was called to make an acceptance address, completely ad-libbed. With a deer-in-the-headlights look on his face, Harry Truman said, quote,
"There's not much more that I can say to you except that I accept the honor with all the humility that a citizen of the United States can assume in this position. Thank you very much."
There was no one happier in that convention hall than Bob Hannigan. Thanks to his and other party bosses' efforts, Henry Wallace would not be on the Democratic ticket in 1944, meaning starting on January 20th, 1945, he would not be next in line in the presidential succession. Later, Hannigan reportedly said he wanted to have the following words inscribed in his tombstone, quote, "Here lies the man who stopped Henry Wallace from becoming President of the United States." The party bosses knew that in choosing a vice president, they very well could be choosing a president, and future events would prove them right. Harry Truman was a very different man from Henry Wallace. The 1944 Democratic Convention changed both men's lives and changed the course of the nation. Had the bosses never taken action, it's possible Roosevelt would have kept Wallace on the ticket. After all, he had to be convinced to dumping him. And the 33rd president would never have been Harry Truman, but a dreamy-eyed mystic named Henry Wallace. But as the convention ended, there was a long road ahead. It was still the middle of 1944. Coming up was the general election, and a war still had to be waged. Although things were turning the Allies' way, the path to ultimate victory promised more months, if not years, of brutal fighting. and big questions remain. Could the Allies secure a long-lasting peace in the post-war world? Could the United States work with the Soviet Union? Would the United Nations work? In the middle of these questions was a weary, aging Franklin Roosevelt. His days were numbered, but as long as he was alive, he remained the critical factor. Over the next few months, FDR made decisions about peace, war, and the fate of nations that remain hotly debated today. Those decisions, along with the political rise of Harry Truman, would have profound implications for the country and for the world. What those decisions were and how they turned out will be explored in our next episode. If you want to learn more about today's episode, check out the book His Final Battle, The Last Months of Franklin Roosevelt by Joseph Lelyveld, Traitor to His Class, The Privileged Life and Radical Presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt by H.W. Brands, An American Dreamer, A Life of Henry A. Wallace by John C. Culver and John Hyde. This American President is produced by myself, Richard Lim, and Michael Neal, with creative consulting from Emily O'Connor. Special thanks to my dad, Bert Chu. Find us on the web at thisamericanpresident.com for show notes about this and all future episodes. Follow us on Twitter at thisamerpres for updates. I'm Richard Lim. We're back next time with Episode 6 of This American President, The Inscrutable Man Part 2.